of environmental science, and we're going to look at basically the Earth's systems and how nutrients and other things cycle through nature and how this cycling impacts global climate change and how our interruption of these cycles affects our climate overall. So I'm going to briefly go through is what is a system in nature and how do systems work, because we're going to talk about living systems, cycling systems, and then how these systems interact with us and how our human activities affect them. So we're going to look at something called the nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle particularly is going to be very important in when we start looking at climate change. Now, the nitrogen cycle we're going to see is linked to other cycles called the phosphorus and sulfur cycles, which are the way we share nutrients from creature to creature. When I think of systems and cycling, I think about the Earth as being a large organism in a way that is dependent on the sunlight and dependent on other aspects of the universe. And I had the luck of visiting Arizona and doing what I call my, one on my bucket list was to visit a research center called the Biosphere 2, and I'd like you to read up on it if you're not familiar with it. They still have a website. You can go visit it if you're in the Tucson area, and it's really kind of a neat experiment that started out looking at how do we study the Earth as a contained environment, and some of it was based on how do we live in outer space, or how do we live in an Earth that's changing and basically make a mini Earth. So this was a real scientific experiment that involved people living in a self-contained environment. And what this taught us over the years, it's now used as a tourism center, and some research actually is done. Matter of fact, a fair amount of research. When I was there was 3 scientific studies going on from people from across the world. So what this taught us was that we really don't know every variable in nature, and we're not familiar with simple little things like the effects of winds, the effect of ocean currents on the Earth systems in itself. So the biosphere was a lesson on how do we study the Earth. And unfortunately, when we look at the Earth, we have to look at it as a controlled experiment in a self-contained environment, which means we have to learn the variables sometimes, and we can't always put in the variables because we don't know what they all are in nature. It's very difficult to measure everything about the complexity of our Earth and the things that come down basically out of the universe. So what is a system? And a system is basically a complex machine. It's a thing that has input, it does something, and it has output. And we can look at the Earth as a machine. This is called mechanistic thinking. We can also look at every organism and every organismic interaction as a machine that has independent variables and a cause and effect. So when we look at things like energy flow in the environment, energy flow is what we call an open system, very much like your car or kind of like us. That means that we have to put something into it, and that something runs the system, and then it is exhausted as a waste that we don't recycle directly. So for example, when you eat food, a lot of your food is broken down into carbon dioxide that you breathe out as a waste or urinate out as something called carbonic acid. And you can't use that CO2 or carbonic acid directly. It has to cycle through outside of your independent system. So the Earth is not really self-contained, just like the biosphere was not really self-contained. The biosphere 2, I should say, it required sunlight, and it required actually eventually outside intervention from the people within because they didn't know all the variables that were cycling into the system. Then we have something called a closed system, and this is more related to the nutrients and actual physical resources that we find in nature. That means elements, minerals, even atmospheric gases. That means that in a closed system is that somehow the substances that we use don't really become waste. They get reused and recycled back to us. So, for example, when you eat food, you break parts of it down into carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere, and plants use it to build nutrients that build their bodies. And then we eat the plants directly, or if you eat animals, you eat the animals that eat the plants. And we get that carbon dioxide back in a form of nutrient. And then again, produce carbon dioxide for the plants. So this is called a closed system. Closed systems are very sensitive system, because that means if a nutrient or some feature that's recycled leaves that system or is exported, that means that that system then can fail. And we have a measure that of this we can call biomass. And biomass is a measure of organism weight, of the amount of nutrients in the environment, whatever you want to look at as far as it being the mass. And we've learned that if biomass gets lost from a closed system, is that the population, the carrying capacity of that closed system decreases, and it affects the populations of all organisms, sometimes uniformly, sometimes disproportionately, depending on the sensitivity of those organisms to a depletion of their resources. So guys, we can look at humans as an example of a typical organism, and that means we can compare ourselves to plants. I've actually used plant models as a way of representing all organisms and how they're affected by the environment. We can look at a worm and find out that a worm is very much like a human. So when we look at the typical creature, and your slide shows an example of the human body, we are composed of about 5 common elements that make up about 90% of us, and then 25 elements of the many hundred and something in nature that we use to construct the rest of our body. So these elements, again, are taken in by a body, used for your molecular structure or used as a source of energy, and then they come out as a waste that you have to then take in again in order for you to maintain your body. So we're constantly cycling in and out energy, we're constantly cycling in and out nutrients and other materials that we need to stay alive. So we rely on our outside environment. We are basically individually an open system, living in a closed system, at least for nutrients, that we call the earth. And when you even look at your own body, each individual cell is a mini system that if one group of cells is not doing their job, you get sick. And this is very important to understand when we look at environmental toxicology, the impacts of pollution and climate change, average temperature changes on all organisms, because one deficiency in this system, that means a lack of a nutrient, a lack of energy, can affect basically our genetic information, can affect how we reproduce and how we carry out our metabolism, which means body functions. Now there's another feature of systems that we notice, and this feature is called emergent properties. And it just means when you look at an individual organism, it's very difficult to tell every aspect of it. I mean, we can look at the structure of an organism's, body plan, but that tells us just so much. Emergent structures basically mean when organisms are interacting with each other and with the environment, then these new properties come out that make it hard to explain. So think of this concept of emergent properties as an organism in itself, has certain particular features, but then you see these things going on that are not inherent or part of the organism itself, but rely on outside factors. So new things begin to emerge from that organism. And again, this is very important in understanding, for example, the example given here are lungs. When we start looking at the function of lungs under normal conditions, it's kind of simple to understand, but then we start looking at in the factor of outside things like pollution or changes in air temperature over time. This then what emerges are new properties of the lungs that we didn't pay attention to before. And this is very typical for those of us that study environmental toxicology or pathology, is we look at normal organisms, compare it to ones that seem to be harmed, and then we try to figure out what caused those factors in the body to become harm or to emerge when you change something about that organism's environment. And that change could be something that is physical, like pollution, or changes in air temperature. So I don't want to get too crazy about this whole idea of systems and emergent properties. But what we have to understand how a system works is what scientists do is we build models of things to better understand the complexities. And this is true in medicine, it's true in basic science, it's true in environmental science, and we try to look at a model. For example, I was using worms as a model of understanding all animals. I was using plants to look at the properties of all organisms in general. And some people use microbes like bacteria and yeast. But the point is a model is a way of reducing a system to in simple parts. And often models in living things we compare to like a machine. Like we can compare it to like a car, how a car functions. Because very much when we look at our own metabolism, it's similar to how a car operates as far as using fuel and producing a waste product and heat and producing work. So when we look at systems, systems have an inflow or an input. And for us, that is energy and nutrients. And then we basically have a certain amount that we take in. And then we have an outflow or a waste, which means energy that we've used up and it comes out in various forms, particularly heat, or our nutrients come out in the form of waste products. Okay, and so we're going to look at this idea of flows, energy flow, and also energy stock. A stock basically meaning a source. And the source is going to be very important because every ecosystem has to have a certain stock or what we call a biomass of that material to keep us going, or a certain amount of energy hitting the environment or entering that environment that allows us to have these adequate inflows and outflows. So when we start looking at cycling and systems, we're going to look at two systems here. One is going to be called the oxygen system or oxygen cycle, and the other is going to be called the carbon cycle. And don't worry about the carbon dioxide there. It's called the carbon cycle. These are two separate cycles, but they rely on each other in a balance. And this is what's kind of neat. So, and we're going to see that oxygen cycle is also associated with the water cycle. And this is going to be critical. It's a lousy A. But and the carbon cycle we're going to leave alone right now because it's also associated with other things. But with the oxygen cycle, we have an inflow, and that means there has to be a certain amount of oxygen in the universe to maintain all of life in our planet. And then there's an oxygen outflow. So usually what happens is organisms take in oxygen and as oxygen gas or as oxygen and nutrients. And that sometimes comes out as a waste called water. And then water is eventually taken into organisms and recycles back as oxygen. With the carbon cycle, this is a strange one. Carbon cycle is not directly related to O2, so ignore those O2s. The carbon cycle, what happens is there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is given off as a waste by plants and animals, and plants in general, through a process called photosynthesis, takes carbon dioxide and turns it into nutrients that are then taken in by animals and microbes and other organisms. And these things cycle through, but don't think that carbon dioxide turns into oxygen. These are just two cycles that work together that depend on each other in a certain ratio. And it's sort of like you depending on a certain amount of water, a certain amount of food in order to survive, and also breathing in oxygen is you have to have it in the right ratio for you to be healthy. So cycles, there's various cycles that require each cycle being there in a certain proportion, and cycles are dependent on each other. That means if the carbon cycle is thrown off, that could also throw off the water and the oxygen cycle. But organisms are an important part of this cycle. That means planets that have no life, or areas like the high mountains of Peru, which literally have almost no living organisms there. Or we look at parts of Antarctic or the Arctic ice sheets, where very little life lives. There's very little cycling going on there, mostly mineral cycling, but not the major cycling that we see that living systems contribute to and keep us alive. So the problem is when humans start affecting the Earth's cycling system. And again, we call these anthropogenic factors. That means factors that are created by humans and aimed at humans. They're meeting human needs. So we find out that certain modifications of the Earth are reducing the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Now remember, oxygen is also important for what cycle? The water cycle. And we also sometimes can increase or decrease the CO2 stock. Unfortunately, we're increasing the CO2 stock, which has various effects. Now here's the problem, is that oxygen, of course, is linked to water cycle, but carbon dioxide is linked directly to what's called the calcium carbonate cycle. And this affects oceans in particular. So as CO2 goes up, it increases the amount of what's called calcium carbonate, and that then creates minerals that sometimes end up in the bodies of organisms or sinking down deep into the earth, and we kind of lose that carbon dioxide, which is good if we're producing too much. But lower CO2 that could occur sometimes in oceans could deplete that. So a calcium carbonate reserve. So once we start messing around with the ratios and volumes of these, we will see that cycles can be interfered with directly or indirectly. So that means if we affect the oxygen cycle, that could impact the carbon dioxide cycle, and particularly with plants, because if we affect how plants work, they will cause an elevation of CO2. If there's too many plants, they will actually lower the CO2 to a level that's not normal. So just understand, cycles interact and they affect each other. And this is what we've learned in experiments like the Biosphere 2, which is very important type of experiment to look at how each variable interacts and causes these emerging properties that are difficult and complex to understand. So this is not going to be the most exciting content, and you're going to see a video that goes along with this. We're going to focus on some very simple, what are called biogeochemical cycles. And that means cycles that living creatures, the geology of the earth, and chemicals in nature that are found in water and atmosphere, how they interact. So our bodies interact with the geology, the mineral part of the earth, the soil, and interact with chemicals that are in the environment, in the atmosphere, in water, and in our food, which would be the bio part, and how these cycle through. And pay attention to where they go, and things that we do that disrupt these cycles, either causing these cycles to deplenish or become too much output, but whatever. But a lot of the biogeochemical cycles are associated with our nutrition, and that means the nutrition of every living organism, plants, animals, microbes, you name it. And particularly the important cycles are what we call macronutrient cycling. That means large molecules like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, things that are involved in your diet are all dependent on cycling. So we can easily change the environment in a way in which animals in a forest cannot have enough macronutrients to maintain the populations. The carrying capacity drops. And we've seen this with humans with famines. There's a group called World Watch that is constantly looking at macronutrient cycling in closed system countries. That means countries that are dependent on their own resources. And as they lose these nutrients by exporting, sometimes, but unfortunately not importing, or just by improper disposal of export materials where it's lost from their environment, this can create famine. And it was a French-Canadian researcher up at McGill University called Jean-Paul Calinvaux who studied this in Canadian forests. As trees were chopped down, he discovered this affected the carbon and nitrogen in the environment, and phosphorus, we'll learn a little later, but these two are the most important ones. When trees were chopped down and exported as paper, it directly impacted, mathematically impacted the amount of wildlife, particularly, grazing animals, and of course predators too, in that area, because he could see immediate effects. And also it affected agriculture. And as we did agriculture and chopped down trees and areas to replace it with crops, that also had a similar impact, because we were taking away input from wilderness areas and giving it totally towards human, which is an anthropogenic activity. So guys, something to remember, that humans do have a negative impact on the earth. We also are capable of positive impacts, hopefully through an emergent technology called geoengineering, or sometimes we could even call it biogeoengineering now. But we have had periods in our history in which the Earth itself created changes and cyclings. And basically, this is true of the early oxygen cycling, because at one time the Earth had no atmospheric oxygen or very little. And then all of a sudden a creature called a blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, they started booming due to the amount of nutrients that were present in the environment, and they started producing tons of oxygen as an output. Well, nature was not used to this oxygen. Oxygen is actually a very deadly molecule to many living creatures, including us. If the oxygen levels are too high, it could cause problems. I mean, they have a treatment in medicine called hyperbaric treatment, and too much hyperbaric treatment can actually bleach the body and damage it, can destroy tissues. So the Earth had this major oxygenation event a couple of billion years ago that wiped out almost all life forms on Earth, but it also led to the life forms we see today called oxygen utilizing organisms, which we are not damaged as much as oxygens as these other creatures a couple of billion years ago. So the Earth does go through these series of events where carbon starts disappearing from the environment and is put into places where we can't get access to, and nitrogen and water and oxygen, and this could affect climate, which then affects temperature, which is a cycling in its own right. So one of the major cycles, and probably the most important cycles we're going to talk about, is what's called the phosphorus cycle. And this is due to the element called phosphorus. And phosphorus is typically found in rock, but is one of the major building blocks of all living cells. It's involved in your DNA and also involved in how your cells take food energy and transfer it to your body so that you're able to survive. So phosphorus is critical, and it's also one of the elements that is in shortest supply and also is more subject to being lost into the environment and depleted. And right now we live in a country that has a depletion of phosphorus, and we actually have to have it exported, particularly for agricultural purposes, to get it into our cycling. So phosphorus is called a limiting factor because the amount of phosphorus determines the amount of living creatures that we find in the Earth. So the phosphorus cycle in itself is pretty complex, but just understand that it's found in rock, and rock naturally is broken down into soil, and eventually the phosphorus that's found in the elements itself are taken up by plants and certain types of microorganisms. And those plants and microorganisms use the phosphorus for their own body purposes. And then what happens is animals eat the plants and they take that phosphorus and then use it for their purposes and produce waste. Now here's what's neat about the phosphorus cycling is as plants take up phosphorus from the soil and from the rock, is plants die and their parts become back part of the soil and rock again, and animals, as they eat plants, they poop and urinate, and that contains phosphorus that goes back into the soil for the plants. And also when the animal dies, excuse me, that phosphorus goes back into the soil. So it's a very tight cycling. The problem that we see with the phosphorus cycle is that a lot of times, particularly when we look at agriculture, is we take the plants from one area, fertilize them with phosphorus, because that's a big component of fertilizer, and then those plants are exported from the area to other places where the phosphorus is lost, which means farmers have to buy phosphorus from somewhere else and put it back in. Now, some farmers reuse some of the crop waste, but still it doesn't take into account the crops that are transported and eaten. It's also the same for animals. If animals like cattle or chicken or sheep are exported, that phosphorus goes with them to other places. Another waste of phosphorus is that with animal waste, we don't let animals, particularly farm animals, die in place. We also don't let their poop accumulate in the environment. Their urine has to. But what happens with us is our poop normally goes into waterways. It gets shoveled away or into landfills where we have to constantly replenish phosphorus. So phosphorus, a lot, its output is exported to other places. And we see, and guys, one of the biggest economies in the world is phosphorus for agricultural purposes. We buy it from certain areas that are high in phosphorus, particularly like Western Canada, and they sell it, they export it, which means they have less for if they need it. South America has other phosphorus reserves that are exported, and they can't use that phosphorus for themselves. And again, a lot of our phosphorus ends up down the toilet and into deep ocean where it's not recovered. So equally important to the phosphorus cycle is the nitrogen cycle. So phosphorus is important in our genetic structure, reproduction, and also in energy transfer of our food. But nitrogen is critical because it is essential for the nutrient protein. Without nitrogen, plants can't build proteins, and that means when we eat plants, those proteins are not available to us. And if other animals eat the plants, obviously it's the same thing. So nitrogen, it has a very complex cycling, which I'm not going to ever ask you details on because it's very, very complicated. And I remember reading an article about it, about looking for the tracing of nitrogen. It's very difficult. What you need to understand that nitrogen spends a lot of its life in the atmosphere as a gas called nitrogen gas, or N2, which is 70% of your atmosphere. You breathe it in, it goes out of your lungs, after, of course, dissolving in your blood and then coming back out. But you don't use that nitrogen. It's useless. Now, some organisms can take that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, meaning bacteria, and they can turn that nitrogen into things like ammonia or something called urea. And ammonia and urea is, to us, kind of like a waste product or a toxin, but to plants, they can use it to build proteins. So plants rely on bacteria taking nitrogen out of the air, put it into the soil, the plants take it up in their roots, and then animals eat the plants and cycle the nitrogen through. Then when plants die or produce waste, that nitrogen goes back into the soil, the animal waste and the animal's dead body puts the nitrogen back into the soil, and then there are bacteria that take the breakdown products of nitrogen and turn it into nitrogen gas. The problem with this cycle is that we got to make sure not too much of the nitrogen turns to nitrogen gas, or else that creates a loss in our terrestrial and aquatic environment, and that causes depletions. Now, the problem with farming sometimes in the way we treat soils is we kill the creatures that take the nitrogen gas and put it back into the environment, into the soil, and that's a problem. So nitrogen cycle, critical. It's also called a limiting factor. That means nitrogen and phosphorus are the two most important elements that limit carrying capacity, that limit our nutrition, and determine the population of everything in the earth. So what I can say about nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, at least the anthropogenic use, that means when people use nitrogen and phosphorus, we hardly ever put it back where it's taken from. So if we're growing plants here, okay, and we eat those plants or use those plants are exported either somewhere else where they're used, and there goes the nitrogen and the phosphorus, or what we do is we use it locally, but then the waste products go out into the ocean where it accumulates, and too much nitrogen and phosphorus can cause overgrowth of bacteria and algae, and in this case, in the Gulf of Mexico, there's Houston right there, Trinity Bay, and that can cause an overabundance of organisms that use up the oxygen in the water and can kill off fish, and can also encourage the growth of algae that are actually toxic, and really not algae, but algae-like creatures called protists. So nitrogen and phosphorus in too large amount can cause environmental damage. In too little, it can cause environmental damage. And this is our big problem when we do sewage treatment and waste disposal, is we really don't cycle the phosphorus and the nitrogen the way it should be. And these are things we have to think about, on how to do this and how to get over some of the problems of doing this and make it affordable. Now, the other cycle that's critical is the carbon cycle, and this is particularly important in relationship to when we start looking at global climate change in the later part of this lecture. So when we look at carbon, the carbon cycle again is basically starts out as a gas called carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is not normally made from oxygen gas. It has a totally different source. Carbon dioxide is basically the breakdown products of molecules. When animals eat molecules or plants break down molecules. But when plants build up molecules, they use photosynthesis to turn carbon dioxide into their own nutrients, into their own molecules. So basically, they build their bodies with the carbon dioxide. And this was a mystery to science for a long time. We did not know how plants built their bodies when there was nothing in the soil that was carbon-based that they could use. So what plants do, or photosynthesis does, is it takes CO2, and that's also true for algae and what are called certain bacteria, and they build their bodies with it. Then herbivores, or primary consumers, which we learned earlier in the semester, take in those nutrients and they use it for their own body. Then they blow out from their mouths CO2 as waste, and they return it back into the atmosphere. And then that CO2 goes back to plants and it starts over again. So basically, when you're eating a plant, you're eating your own CO2 that gets back into the environment. And then consumers get their carbon dioxide in the form of nutrients from the herbivores. And then this animal, returns the carbon dioxide through their breath or through body decay. So when these creatures die, their bodies also release carbon dioxide from what's called detritus. That means decaying matter. So again, understand carbon cycle and understand that we add to the carbon cycle by burning wood and fossil fuels and other things. And this is important because we could easily elevate the carbon dioxide to the point where it can get to unbreathable levels. But usually what happens is plants will take in that carbon dioxide, either oceanic plants or terrestrial plants like, trees. Carbon dioxide could also be absorbed by the oceans, but the problem is that creates acidic oceans that can be deadly to a lot of creatures. So you want the carbon dioxide to be precisely balanced to the amount of plants and the amount of animals in the environment. It's a delicate balance that we throw off by burning stuff. And this was true early in human history. We burned so much wood and other energy sources throughout our history that we were already modifying the world before the technological revolution. So again, the carbon cycle is linked to water, because oceans can absorb and also give off CO2. Plus, in the oceans, the CO2 can get turned into rock, where that CO2 is permanently taken out of the environment. We sometimes call that CO2 sequestering. Long-living trees could also do this. They can take carbon dioxide and almost permanently remove it from the environment until they die and decay. So carbon could enter what's called the rock cycle and be buried for years. Now, the problem is if we disturb that rock, that could bring the carbon dioxide back. So please understand the cycling and understand that the carbon cycling we're going to see later is linked to global climate change, because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts like a blanket that traps heat on the Earth. Now, another problem with the carbon cycle, it's related to a metabolism called the methanogen cycle. And basically, methanogens are creatures that, under low oxygen conditions, what we call anoxic conditions, they produce a waste product called methane gas, NH4. And methane gas is a major greenhouse gas. It is probably much more severe as a warmer of the Earth's climates than CO2 in itself. So if the carbon and oxygen cycle are thrown off, we can end up with overabundance of the methanogenic cycle. Now, the other thing too is all animals, as they're metabolizing and producing CO2, they're also producing methane gas as a waste product, usually from their burps or their farts. Okay, and this is a problem. Now, when we look at agriculture and just wildlife in general, different types of organisms produce different amounts of methane. So if we're growing lots of cattle in an area, you will see that cattle per pound of meat produce much more methane than any other creature. When we start looking at alternative foods like pigs, chickens not on here, sheep, and even wild type cattle like I used to eat when I was in Asia. Okay, not the best meat, but it tastes okay. Okay, sometimes chewy. Okay, so agriculture is a major producer of methane. Also, wetlands, swamps, particularly stagnant areas, are a place of natural but also anthropogenic methane as we change the nature of the Earth. So we're producers of methane. Petroleum refineries produce methane. So these are all things we got to pay attention to, that is related to the carbon cycle, but also related to our own activities that increase the amount of methane production in this earth. Now, termites and roaches produce tons of methane too. But the thing is, we don't need to make it worse by growing tons of cattle and livestock. So we're going to transition to how the carbon cycle is related to global climate change. Because as I mentioned, we have the Earth, okay, and we have an atmosphere around the Earth. Okay, whoa, we lost a little of our atmosphere there. And then we have this big burning ball of mass called the sun. Okay. And the problem we have when we start looking at CO2, I'm going to put CO2 as kind of like a dark blue dot there. Okay, so when we look at CO2, the amount of CO2 gas in our atmosphere acts sort of like a glass window, which we sometimes call the greenhouse effect. And what that means is that when sunlight comes down to the earth, the sunlight is able to penetrate the carbon dioxide and heat the earth. But the problem is when the earth gets heated as a result of that sunlight hitting the earth gives off heat, and that heat gets trapped directly proportionate to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if there's very little carbon dioxide, the same amount of sunlight hits the earth, but more heat escapes into the atmosphere and keeps the earth cooler. It's like a thinner blanket. The more CO2 you put in that blanket, the less heat it gets trapped by the CO2 and creates heating of not only the Earth's surfaces, but the whole atmosphere in general and the oceans. So carbon dioxide, water, methane are three big things that interfere with the regulation of the Earth's heat. And the problem is the carbon cycle is linked to the water cycle and linked to methane production. So when carbon cycle is off, it, in the three-way effect, affects the warming or cooling in some cases of the Earth. And we have a science called geoengineering, which is looking at how do we manage this? How do we control this? If we can't control the carbon dioxide, could we put spaceships up there and giant things that block the sun, satellites? Can we change the coloring of the Earth, or put up blankets over certain areas, or whatever, as a way of modifying the Earth to accommodate for the carbon dioxide that is being elevated, or in some cases depleting? So human activity is one of the major external CO2 producers. That means we are introducing CO2 into the system at higher levels than the system is used to. And again, what the system usually does is it absorbs the CO2 in the atmosphere, in the oceans, it's taken up by plants, but the thing is it builds up. And it becomes at an abnormal level so that the other cycles are thrown off. But particularly, it affects the atmospheric temperature, aside from other things. Now, of course, it does cause ocean acidification too, which is a major, major problem, because that can kill aquatic life and also affect, again, weather patterns and stuff like that. So please understand the importance of what happens when we produce CO2. And not so much the CO2 you breathe out, but the CO2 we use whenever we use combustion. Because when we get into talking about energy, we're going to look at how do we make energy without producing CO2. And that means we have to get away from burning fuels, producing steam using traditional resources, or what we call combustion. So we're going to start looking at things like nuclear, which in itself doesn't directly produce CO2. And also things like hydropower, which indirectly doesn't produce CO2 when you're obtaining particularly electricity from those sources. So guys, the cost of climate change can be looked at in many, many ways. Climate change has major effects on agriculture. It has major effects on climate, and climate has major effects on storms. Being in our area, we're very familiar with that. But as CO2 levels climb over time, what we're learning is that so do major catastrophic events and the Earth's temperature. So we can look at the amount of CO2 being produced by humans, because we have to pay attention that it's CO2 comes from other sources. And as that goes up, we're also seeing increases, and it's not going to be a straight line, but increases in the average temperature of the Earth, but also increases in horrible natural disasters, particularly like wildfires that are due to rainfall patterns being changed, and also major storms that are due to ocean temperature and atmospheric temperature changes. So climate change has its costs. The thing that we have to think about as a society is, what are we willing to pay to prevent the damage? So right now, we live in a lifestyle that we absorb the damage and just pay for it and become resilient. That means we bounce back, but not in a sustainable way, because it costs us a lot and people lose their livelihoods, and it affects poor people disproportionately. Coastal areas have a problem too, because as climate change creates more higher temperatures, ice packs form, the ocean expands. I mean, ice packs melt, the oceans expand, and that causes coastal flooding, which all the Gulf Coast, East Coast, West Coast are very sensitive to. Hawaii, many parts of the world are sensitive to this. And that could be almost a permanent change in a way if those coastlines disappear. There are islands in the Pacific totally submerged now that were never submerged before. I mean, at least in the time that humans settled there, tens of thousands of years ago. So we have to look at the cost, and we have to say, am I going to live with the cost of the damage and rebuild or be resilient, or am I going to try to be sustainable about it and put in money to reduce climate change and not having to deal with all these issues associated with it? Guys, there's a lot of science behind measuring global climate change. And believe me, temperature measurements go back a long way, and we could even dig into rock, dig into ice sheets. We could even look at tree rings and determine what the temperature was like in ancient times with pretty good accuracy. Well, we do see from the 1860s, I mean, that second wave of technological revolution where it was now being globalized, and developing countries are starting to get a hold of machinery, and countries that were developed were using machinery at an unprecedented rate. People were using a lot of technology. We saw a steady increase in CO2 in the atmosphere that we could link to human activity, but also what we saw was this average temperature pretty much staying stable, getting a little higher, and then increasing dramatically in direct proportion to technological growth, particularly after the 1980s, where we saw incredible growth of our population and an incredible amount of technology, guys. And don't think that phones and internet don't contribute to this. To run the internet, it is one of the most heavily using CO2 producers out there, because all the supercomputers and electricity needed to run it. It's amazing. So when you think about it, every time you get on your phone, you're probably contributing as much CO2 as a diesel truck right now. So there are many hidden areas we don't think about when we look at how electricity and energy are produced and how that's impacted by even the smallest technologies. So much of what we're seeing is that we can correlate higher temperatures with increasing amounts of CO2. And guys, we could also do that with methane and with water vapor in the atmosphere. But water vapor and methane also are proportionate to CO2 and how it causes global climate change. That means if CO2 goes up, it worsens the global warming by also allowing the elevation of methane and water vapor. So it's a triple action that's going on here that we have to pay attention to. And the easiest thing for us to resolve is probably to reduce CO2 production. And that means, guys, we're going to have to reduce technology. So guys, so besides measuring temperature on Earth, we can do a lot of remote sensing. And remote sensing, I've been involved in some of it, could be used for looking at the health of plants and how they're using CO2 from outer space. It can look at the heating of certain parts of the Earth and whether it's changing overnight. It could even break the Earth down literally into square-inch sections and look at how these sections over time are changing. This is used a lot in predicting hurricane forecast models for intensity and direction. So people, particularly called climatologists, are relying more and more on ground-based monitoring of temperature. I mean, schools even volunteer to do this in their schoolyards. The kids can take temperature, measure rainfall and cloud cover. And if we are on campus, and all the time, we can do that too, measure it all the time. And then satellites can do real-time measurement all across the Earth. So temperature is readily being monitored. And as far back as the 1700s, it was being monitored again by ground temperature, because they didn't have satellites back then, by ground temperature measurements, because temperature is important for agriculture and also for our own survival. Now, people, when we start looking at climate change and reading temperature measures, there are many critics of global climate change, and there are many what we call deniers. The critics usually say, well, the data's not accurate for looking at global climate change because it could be due to solar cycles. Some people just believe that climate change is fake anyway, and it's not happening. Some people argue that it's not being produced by CO2, but it's mostly by methane or other factors, which is true, but it's not solely, partially true, but it's not solely methane or water vapor. And I've actually given talks on this and got a lot of criticism, not so much from the public, but from, deniers from either petrol industry or, some other groups that were just, opposed to the idea of accepting the fact that global climate change is an anthropogenic factor. So when we look at the solar radiance in particular, we see that with solar radiance, yes, the sun produces various amounts of intensity of sunlight that do cause cooling and heating of the Earth through cycles. But guys, look at this pattern right here. This is looking at the global climate change in itself, the temperature of the Earth in general. And look over here, it's correlated to the natural cycles of the sun, which runs from about the 1800s to about the 1960s. And guys, in the 1960s, throughout the world, people didn't have a lot of cars. Well, and we didn't have a lot of technology, particularly, like TVs and, cable and stuff like that, and all these other things and whatever, all these electronic devices. And starting, right around the late 60s, 70s, we started seeing an increase in devices, but also an increase in CO2 production and an increase in the Earth's temperature. So if we were to look at CO2 production, we'd also see a line that kind of goes like this and then shoots up like that too. So understand, guys, is that yes, the sun has fluctuations, but the sun's fluctuations can't explain this. And we can subtract out a lot of things, but we're going to discover that anthropogenic CO2 is probably the major factor in producing this climate change that is a spike that is going up to the point where we don't want to reach a 4-degree temperature change. We don't even want to reach a 2-degree temperature change, and we don't want to exceed 0.04% CO2 in the atmosphere, because once you get above 0.4%, it starts becoming a very thick blanket over this Earth. So this graph is kind of a little difficult to understand, but just pay attention to basically this value right here from 0 down to here, and then look at these values here. So that is the United States contribution, the European Union's contribution. European Union is mostly industrialized nations. Okay, we look at other developed countries, Russia, China, this is their amount, their contribution. Notice how much bigger it is than ours, but this is mostly population dependent. Ours is per capita dependent. So, and this is per capita dependent. And then we look at the rest of the world's contribution. It means everybody else. So when we look at the developed countries, guys, this is a problem. The developed countries, because we go right to about here, are producing at least 75% of, and I don't know why they don't put Russia and China with developed, because they are really developed. Okay, maybe not as dense as we are, but they are developed as far as technology goes and pollution goes. So they are producing the major amounts, where the rest of the world that's not using all these resources and sometimes even exports their resources are suffering. So guys, so we contribute to a lot of CO2, yet we don't suffer as much from it as people in other countries. This is environmental justice, or an injustice actually. So guys, so America, per capita, we use more and produce more CO2 than China, but they produce more by volume because they have like, 8 times more people than we do. So pay attention to this. What we have to try to do is convince the world that has the large energy using populations and us that are very energy intensive. That means we have a very high footprint, almost 7 times higher than other developed countries and 20 times higher than not, than developing countries. And this is ridiculous. So this is where the CO2 is coming from. And again, a lot of it is for the production of electricity, for manufacturing, and believe it or not, for petrol production too. But it drives our technology, including things like the internet. So just a little summary picture again. We can look at human history to about, again, the late 1900s. And we also see human population correlates with this beautifully. We looked at that a little earlier in the semester. But we look at carbon dioxide, shoots up. As that shoots up, so does methane. These are directly linked. And also the nitrous oxide, the nitrogen cycle also goes up. Nitrous oxide also contributes to some greenhouse gas, not that much, but it's mostly involved in what we call acid precipitation, which could worsen global climate change in itself. So we're coming close to the end of our session on this, but guys, understand global climate change, which we usually call GCC. We don't really call it global warming anymore because some parts of the earth are cooling, some parts are warming. That's what's weird about all of this. But the average atmospheric temperature in general that surrounds the earth is getting warmer. And every 2 degrees Celsius warmer it gets, that is not good. Because, it really does have an impact on the average highs that could occur. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But guys, global climate change does occur naturally, and it does wipe out life. But the problem is, during this period of time that we call the Anthropocene period, that followed this period of time when humans started prevailing and becoming technological creatures, we've seen an incredible change in temperature. Actually, the Earth was supposed to be getting cooler during our period, and now we entered a slight warming period, but we've accelerated that warming period to the point where we're affecting glaciers and icebergs and ice caps that were still part of that cooling period. And we're creating our own warming period like you found around the Jurassic area. The Earth was all tropical, and that meant there were no ice packs. The world had less continents. It also had it had larger oceans and was very swampy. So, and particularly during this era, when the temperature, at the end of this era. So please pay attention to that. As certain eras, occur, temperature goes from very brutally cold to warm. But the thing is, that's natural. Now what we're doing is adding an unnatural component to it. And some people argue that humans are natural. We are part of the environment, and I can accept that argument. But I also can accept the fact that we are doing it in a way beyond the way the checks and balances of the earth can correct it. And guys, we're changing the earth in a way that we won't be able to survive in it. And that's not acceptable. And maybe it should be. Maybe it should wipe us out, and then we'll go through a cycling that brings things back to normal, very much like what happened here at the end of the Carboniferous, where, we had this incredible temperature change, and then it became the age of the dinosaurs and started a whole new living series of creatures again. So guys, when you start talking about global climate change to people, the general atmosphere, global atmosphere, is getting warmer, but different parts of the earth, that means at ground level, are showing changes in climate. And guys, not changes in weather. Weather is a daily event. Climate is a long-term event. So we're going to start seeing 2 major effects that affect temperature and effects on rainfall patterns, precipitation, humidity. So we're going to see that some areas are going to become more wet or extremely wet. Some are going to become more dry or more extremely dry. And this is we're seeing right now, in the Southwest, that it's becoming not only warmer, but drier. So some areas are going to get warmer and wetter, warmer and drier. Some areas are going to get cooler and wetter, cooler and drier. And this is going to have a major effect on agriculture on wildlife, on biomes and everything. And we're starting to see these extremes now in long-term weather patterns that are affecting agriculture, they're affecting everything, even the vegetation around you. Now, something very important is this can directly impact our health too. So if we look at, guys, deaths, okay, and this sounds kind of horrible, but we're going to look at population, okay, of elderly people. I'm just going to put that on here right now, draw a graph, and down here is going to be temperature range, and we're going to see that at certain temperatures, that means atmospheric temperatures, okay, is ideal for people. That's about 80% of the population of elderly people. But what happens, and this is this means healthy population. What happens here is that when the temperatures get high, we start seeing the population of elderly people go down, or they're dying, and the same is true for cold. So that means there's an ideal temperature which elderly people stay alive and are healthy. When you get into the extremes, they die, lower or upper extremes. So I attended a conference once, and they had a medical researcher who studied environmental factors that affect human health, particularly health of the elderly. And he was in France when one of the heat waves that are occurring. France and a lot of Europe is having these extensive heat waves now they never had before. And guys, what you got to understand in parts of Europe, I mean, I've been there, lived there, is that a lot of us don't have air conditioning. It's expensive, and it's most of the time not needed. You just open up windows. As a matter of fact, in New York City, when my family settled there, we didn't have air conditioning. We never used it. Or the place we lived, the projects didn't have air conditioning in general. Everybody there was used to opening their windows. I mean, probably now some people have more money to get window units, but back then we didn't. But the point is that we had no air conditioning, and we dealt with the heat. Now in France, people were dealing with the heat. But what happened was we started seeing a shift in temperature that was causing more deaths. What was happening is that the temperature range of France, which normally was existing here, within that range, let's say, with very little time in the extremes, that was either people were freezing to death or dying from heat. And what we mean by dying from heat, it means that your heart works harder, your body shuts down, your blood flow stops, and this is a problem. So most of the time what we see is cardiac-related heat damage. This is what this researcher was showing. If you can't keep your body cool, your heart tends to fail. And the heart is what helps to distribute and get rid of heat in the first place. So what happens is that the average temperature of France shifted over a little to right about here. The lower went there, the higher went here, which that meant now, look guys, more people now are in that range of death. Okay, so this is a problem. And this is going to be something that they have to deal with. How they can address it, they don't know. Because the problem is, too, is that when middle-aged people are on the street, they tend to get heart attacks more from the heat, whereas under normal conditions, they wouldn't. So it makes the condition worse. So when we start looking at the effects of heat, guys, slight temperature differences, slight. Because the problem with being in heat is that the longer you're in it, the more likely you are to die. And when you start getting prolonged heat in areas that are not used to it, this pushes people past the brink of illness to death. And that's what this medical researcher showed. This is one of the best sessions I ever attended in my whole life. As far as looking at if you shift temperature, what does it do to human death? And it's also true for animals and plants. We're seeing it now in various environments, in various biomes. Now, last but not least is something that's confusing to people. So we have to change in temperature. Okay, we have change in humidity. But we're also going to see sea level rising. Now, sea level does rise and fall. That's true, and that is due to sometimes changing climate like we've seen over the history of the Earth, and due to ice caps melting or forming, again, which is cyclic, but not over the period we're seeing lately, and not at the rate we're seeing lately. So when we start looking at coastlines, particularly coastlines that have shallow slope, okay, I've been to the ones up here, cold as hell, okay, and all over here, nice and warm, Okay, but anyway, so what happens when the Earth heats? Ice caps in certain areas, mountaintops in the extreme north, extreme south, they start to melt, and they can release billions and billions of gallons of water in no time during that melting. And what's sad, when I used to go up to Alaska to consult, in the time I was consulting within an 8-year period, I would go to this glacier called in Whittier, Alaska, not too far from Seward, Alaska, between Seward and Anchorage, Alaska. And I watched a glacier melt away. And I was stupid once and actually went on this one glacier called Portage Glacier and did a little ice climbing on it. I'm not very agile, but I had enough equipment to keep me from flipping off and dying and falling into this lake, which was about 500 feet below me. But I got off the glacier, came back down, went to change my clothes because I was soaking wet and sweaty, even though it was like 40s out. Okay, and got back, and then I wanted a picture of me overlooking the glacier. And what was really funny was that I found these Russian people that were visiting Alaska, because Alaska used to be part of their country, and I was asked them to take a picture of me. And right before I took that picture, I didn't realize that when I was getting changed, a chunk of that glacier fell off into the water, caused a little tsunami near this what do you call it, a nature center, a nature building or information building, which was right near this glacier. And the Russians took a picture of me with this iceberg type thing that broke off the glacier right behind me. I mean, I can post a picture if you want, but it happened like at that day. And I'm thinking I could have died if I was on that chunk, but they were kind of laughing as I was telling them I climbed it. And they told me, you can't be Russian in origin to have done that. So whatever, it's kind of a joke on my part, but whatever. So when these ice melts, it elevates water, and that can inundate shallow coastal areas. Also, as oceans warm, which is what's happening, we know that. We're seeing it now with incredible hurricane and typhoon cycles, is that the seas expand. The ocean expands, the water expands as you heat it slightly, and that also creates a problem. So guys, cycles are important. Understand and be able to apply how we affect cycles and how do we correct them. And there's a science called geoengineering and biogeoengineering, which is looking at ways of using technology and the proper manipulation of organisms to correct the changes. But guys, we have to learn how to recycle our waste. We have to learn how to use less technology, or technology that relies on electrical energy or some type of machine operating it.